The house had never felt so quiet. Even the ticking of the old clock seemed louder that morning. Emily stood in the doorway, watching the man roll paint along the faded walls of her hallway. The scent of fresh paint filled the air clean, sharp and new but underneath it. She could still sense the memories that clung to every corner. Her husband. Daniel had once promised to repaint the house himself. He never did. That was 2 years ago, before work trips, late-night meetings, and the long silences over dinner began to replace their laughter. Now their home looked tired, and so did their marriage. The painter's name was Mark. He arrived just after sunrise. Polite but distant, with his sleeves rolled up and his tools neatly arranged. He moved with quiet focus, his brush gliding across the wall in smooth strokes. Emily offered him coffee, expecting little more than polite small talk. But when he smiled a small, genuine smile, it caught her off guard. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice calm and grounded. She nodded, trying not to notice how his presence changed the air around her. There was something peaceful about the way he worked. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. Just the sound of paint meeting wall, the rhythmic scrape of the roller, the creak of the ladder. Emily lingered in the hall longer than she meant to. She told herself she was just making sure he didn't need anything. But the truth was simpler and harder. She liked having someone around. Someone who filled the silence without trying to. The hall had been the heart of their home once. Family photos lined its walls, each one a snapshot of better times, Daniel holding her hand at the lake, the two of them laughing with friends, a picture from their honeymoon in Maine. But now the photos were slightly crooked. Some dusty, a few even missing their frames. The colors had faded just like them. Mark noticed one of the empty hooks. "You taking those down?" he asked, his tone gentle. "Not yet," she said, glancing at it. "Waiting for the right time." He nodded, as if he understood more than she'd said. Sometimes waiting becomes a habit. That sentence stayed with her. There was something in his voice, unguarded. She wanted to ask what he meant, but she didn't. Instead, she busied herself with small things, making tea, wiping an already clean counter, pretending she wasn't watching the way light fell across his shoulders as he worked. By noon, the hall had transformed. The dull beige was replaced with a soft, warm color that seemed to breathe life into the house. For the first time in months, Emily felt like the space was hers again. "It looks different already," she said, standing beside him. "It's not just the paint," he replied quietly. "Sometimes a little change makes everything else easier to see." Their eyes met, and for a second, neither of them looked away. There was no spark of scandal in that moment. No forbidden thought, just a quiet recognition between two lonely people who had both stopped expecting to be seen. When Daniel called that afternoon, Emily's heart sank before she even answered. His tone was rushed. "Hey, I'll be home late again. Don't wait up, all right?" she said softly. He didn't ask about the house or the painting or her day. The call ended as quickly as it began. She stared at her phone for a long moment, then at the freshly painted wall. "Everything okay?" Mark asked gently. She forced a small smile. "Just work stuff." "My husband's been busy," he nodded, but didn't say anything more. It was a kind of silence that didn't feel heavy. It felt safe. Later that day, when he packed up his tools, Emily found herself wishing he'd stay a bit longer. The hall felt warmer with him in it. As he cleaned his brushes, he glanced toward one of the framed photos of Emily and Daniel. "That was a good day?" he asked. "It was," she said, remembering the picture. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Mark didn't reply, but his expression softened. He understood things without needing to ask. That was what made it harder. His quietness made her feel heard in a way she hadn't felt in years after he left. The house grew still again. Emily walked through the hall, letting her fingers trail along the smooth new paint. The color was soft but deep. It reminded her of early autumn light, something both calm and sad. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she'd been holding back. Daniel came home around midnight. She heard the door, the sound of his shoes on the floor, the faint clink of his keys on the counter. He peeked into the hall, looked around briefly, and said, "Looks nice." Emily looked up from the couch. "Do you like it?" "Yeah, good choice," he said absently, already turning toward his study. "I'll be in there for a while. Big meeting tomorrow." The hall light flickered as he walked away. She watched his shadow disappear around the corner and felt the same emptiness return. Even stronger now. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of the way Mark had said, "Sometimes waiting becomes a habit." The words repeated in her mind like a quiet truth she didn't want to face. It wasn't about Mark, not really. It was about everything she'd stopped expecting from her marriage. The warmth, the laughter, the attention. She had spent so long convincing herself that things would get better, that silence could be love, that absence meant effort. But deep down, she knew she was just painting over cracks. The next morning, she stood in the hall again, running her fingers along the smooth wall. It was still slightly cool to the touch, the scent of paint faint but lingering. It smelled like change and like something unfinished. For a brief moment, she thought about calling Mark. The next morning began with the soft hum of rain against the windows. Emily stood by the kitchen counter, pouring herself coffee when she heard a gentle knock on the door. Mark stood there, his jacket damp from the drizzle, holding 2 paper cups. "I brought you one," he said, smiling shyly. "Thought you might need it after all that painting." Emily laughed lightly. "That's thoughtful of you. Come in before you catch a cold." He stepped inside, shaking off his jacket and setting the coffee on the counter. The smell of rain mixed with fresh paint filled the air, and for a moment, it felt like the house was breathing again. Emily hadn't realized how much she missed. Small gestures like this simple kindness without expectation. They walked down the hall, and Mark began preparing for the day's work. The walls gleamed softly under the light, the new color richer now that it had dried. Emily leaned against the doorway, sipping her coffee as she watched him. He moved with quiet purpose, his brush gliding along the trim, his focus calm but steady. There was something soothing in his rhythm, like he was painting peace back into the house. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "do you paint full-time?" He glanced up. "Yeah, been doing it for a few years. Before that, I worked in construction. Didn't like the noise. Painting's quieter, gives me time to think." She smiled. "About what?" Just to thank him again. But she didn't. Instead, she took down one of the old photos, the one of her and Daniel laughing in the sunlight, and set it on the table. The frame had a small chip in the corner, something she'd never noticed before. She stared at it for a while, realizing that sometimes things didn't break all at once. Sometimes they wore down quietly, piece by piece, till there was nothing left but habit. Outside, the morning light poured through the window, touching the freshly painted walls with warmth. Emily took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel complete, but she felt something, a stirring of life, a reminder that she was still capable of feeling. And in that soft, lonely moment, she whispered to the empty hall, "It's a start." The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like space, space to breathe, space to remember who she was, space to decide what came next. He shrugged, dipping the brush into the paint, about how colors can change how a place feels, or how people change and don't even notice. Emily's chest tightened at that. She didn't respond, but the thought stayed with her. People did change slowly, quietly, until one day you looked at them and realized they drifted, somewhere you couldn't follow. Daniel had left early again that morning. No kiss goodbye, not even a note. Just a text, "Out of town tomorrow. Don't wait up." It wasn't new, but it still hurt. She didn't tell Mark. She just smiled faintly and said, "You're right. Change sneaks up on you." As the morning passed, their conversation grew easier. They talked about music, movies, little things that filled the empty hours. Mark told her about his dog, how it always barked at thunder but slept through fireworks. Emily shared that she used to take photos of sunsets when she first moved into the house. "Why'd you stop?" he asked. She hesitated. "Because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing them." The words came out softer than she intended, and she quickly looked away. Mark didn't press. He just nodded and went back to painting. His silence kind, not empty. By noon, the rain had stopped. Light poured through the hallway window, catching flecks of dust in the air. The house seemed alive again. Emily brought out lunch, 2 sandwiches, and a bowl of fruit. "You've been working nonstop," she said. "Take a break." He smiled. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I want to." They ate, sitting on the floor, surrounded by open paint cans and brushes. It was simple and quiet, but strangely intimate. Emily hadn't shared a meal that felt this easy in a long time. There was no pressure to fill the silence, just a soft understanding between them. When they finished, Mark stood and looked at the wall. "It's almost done," he said. "One more coat should do it." Emily nodded, though she felt an unexpected pang at the thought of him leaving soon. She didn't want to admit it, even to herself. But his presence had become something she looked forward to, a soft light in a dim space. As he reached up to paint near the ceiling, its ladder wobbled slightly. Without thinking, Emily stepped forward and grabbed it. "Careful," she said quickly. Mark steadied himself, then looked down at her. Their hands were close, her fingers brushing against his. Time seemed to stop for a second. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Not a word, not even a thought, just a quiet recognition of the loneliness they both carried. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pulling his hand back. "It's fine," she whispered. Though her heart was pounding, he climbed down slowly, setting the brush aside. The air felt different now, charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Emily turned away, pretending to check her phone. A message from Daniel flashed on the screen. "Flight delayed. Won't make it home until next week." No apology, no warmth. Just words. She set the phone down without replying. When she looked up, Mark was watching her, not with pity, but with understanding. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, forcing a small smile. Just a long week. He didn't ask anything else. That small mercy felt like the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a long time. The afternoon drifted by in comfortable silence. She watched him work, his steady movements filling the empty space with calm energy. It reminded her of how Daniel used to build things around the house back when they still shared laughter and plans. But that was another time, another version of them when the day ended. The hall looked almost complete, bright, warm, and alive again. Mark packed his tools slowly, as if he wasn't in a rush to leave. "You'll have a new hallway tomorrow," he said lightly. "Fresh start." Emily smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Fresh starts are good," she said. "They remind you what's worth keeping." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah, they do." She walked him to the door, the sound of rain starting again outside. He hesitated before stepping out. "See you tomorrow, Emily?" Her name on his lips felt too personal, too gentle. "See you," she replied softly. After he left, the silence in the house returned, but it wasn't the same. It felt thicker somehow, full of things she didn't want to think about. She walked through the hall, running her hand along the wall, the paint still slightly cool. It was beautifully exactly what she wanted, but it didn't fix the emptiness inside her. Later that night, she sat in the living room, trying to read, but her mind kept drifting back to him. To the way he smiled, the way his voice softened when he spoke, the quiet care in his movements. She wasn't in love, she knew that. It wasn't love. It was something simpler, something sadder. It was the feeling of being noticed when you'd forgotten what that felt like. The rain grew heavier outside. Emily set her book down and looked toward the hall. The light flickered faintly, and for a moment she imagined him there again. Paintbrush in hand, eyes full of quiet understanding. She knew she shouldn't think about him, but she did anyway. Not out of longing, but because for the first time in a long time, someone had looked at her like she was still someone worth seeing, and as she turned off the light and went upstairs alone, she whispered to herself, "It's just the paint." But deep down, she knew it. By the third morning, the house smelled faintly of paint and rain. The storm had passed overnight, leaving behind a quiet, washed-out light that slipped through the windows. Emily stood in the hall looking at the nearly finished walls. They were smooth, soft, and warm, like a new beginning that still didn't know what it was becoming. Mark arrived right on time, as always. His truck pulled up quietly, and he stepped out with his usual calm expression, carrying his brushes and a small box of supplies. But today, there was something different in his eyes, something thoughtful, almost distant. "Morning," Emily greeted, her voice lighter than she felt. "Morning," he said, giving her a small nod. "Almost done. Just need to finish the trim and one last coat." She nodded, trying to sound casual. "You've done a great job. It looks beautiful," he smiled, setting down his tools. "It's the color. You picked a good one. Feels like sunlight, even when it's cloudy." The compliment was simple, but the way he said it softly, sincerely made her heart skip for a reason she couldn't quite explain. She didn't want to feel it, didn't want to read too much into anything. But sometimes the smallest words could carry the heaviest weight. For a while, they worked side by side, Molly cleaning up the baseboards, Mark painting the final sections. The sound of his brush moving back and forth filled the silence. It was peaceful, but underneath that peace, there was a quiet tension neither of them dared to touch. At one point, his brush slipped, leaving a darker streak across the paint. He frowned slightly, sighing. "Pushed too deep," he muttered. Emily smiled faintly. "It's all right. Everyone does, sometimes." He looked up at her, and something in his eyes changed. The words hung between them, their simple meaning stretching into something else, something unspoken. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air felt heavier, the quiet more fragile. He wiped the excess paint from the wall and set the brush down carefully. "Emily," he started, but his voice faded. She turned, her pulse quickening. "Yes." He shook his head slightly, forcing a smile. "Nothing. Just talking to myself." But they both knew that wasn't true. They continued working, but the easy rhythm from before was gone. Every movement, every glance felt deliberate. When she handed him the cloth or moved past him to reach something, her breath caught just slightly. The space between them wasn't wide, but it was full of things that shouldn't be said aloud. After a while, he stepped back to admire his work. "There," he said, exhaling. "All done." Emily looked around the hall. It was perfect. The walls seemed to glow softly in the afternoon light, warm and calm. "It's beautiful," she said again, her voice quieter this time. He nodded, but didn't look at the wall. He looked at her instead, steady, uncertain, as if trying to decide whether to speak or stay silent. "You ever think about starting over?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "Starting over?" "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "Like changing everything. Not because it's broken, but because you've been pretending it isn't." The words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to answer, but the truth was too raw to speak. Instead, she looked down at the floor. "Sometimes," she whispered. He nodded, as if that was all the answer he needed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them was no longer comfortable, was full, alive, trembling with something unnamed. He took a slow step forward, not close enough to touch her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said quietly. "But I see it." She swallowed. "See what?" "That you're tired of being invisible." The honesty in his words made her chest tighten. Her throat felt dry, her hands cold. She didn't reply. She couldn't, because he was right, and hearing it from someone else made it real. He sighed, rubbing his hands together. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." "No," she said softly. "It's okay." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes I forget that not everything that's true should be said out loud." Emily looked up at him then. Really looked at him, the way his eyes held kindness, but also restraint. The way his shoulders seemed to carry quiet stories he'd never tell. He was a stranger, but in some strange way, he felt familiar. Like he understood a version of her that even she had forgotten. When he began cleaning his brushes, she stood nearby, unsure whether to help or to leave. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was filled with things that had already been said without words. Finally, he broke it. "You deserve more than silence, Emily." She froze. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, looking down at his paint-stained hands. "Just, people forget that love needs to be seen, not just promised." Her breath trembled. She didn't know how to respond. His words weren't romantic, not really. They were something else, gentle but sharp, like truth spoken too softly to hurt. Yet it did anyway. "I shouldn't." He started, then stopped. "Forget it." She stepped closer. "No, please, don't take it back." He met her eyes then, and in that moment, everything slowed. It wasn't about attraction or desire, it was about recognition. Two souls who had both been quiet for too long, suddenly remembering what it meant to be heard. But before either of them could say another word, the sound of a car door outside broke the spell. Emily turned sharply. It was just a delivery van passing by, but the sound was enough to pull her back to herself. Reality came rushing in the house, her marriage. The line she knew she couldn't cross. Mark picked up his toolbox and gave her a small, tired smile. "I should go. The paint needs time to settle." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for everything." He paused at the door. "Don't thank me. Just don't let the quiet take you again." And then he was gone. Emily stood alone in the hall, the scent of paint still heavy in the air. She touched the wall where the brush had left that darker streak earlier, the one he'd called a mistake. But it didn't look like a mistake now. It looked human, imperfect, real. For a long time, she just stood there, her hand on the wall, breathing slowly. She felt the tears come, not from sadness, but from release. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding in until that moment. Outside, sky began to clear and soft light filled the hall again. Everything was still except for her heartbeat, which finally felt like it belonged to her again. When Daniel called later that night, she answered. He talked about meetings and travel plans, his voice distant and tired. She listened quietly, offering small replies. He didn't notice her tone, didn't ask how she was. When the call ended, she looked around at the freshly painted hall. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also a reminder of how easily silence could build walls, of how one kind word from a stranger could shake the foundation of years of emptiness. Emily sat on the stairs, staring at the walls that now glowed under the evening light. The house felt different. She felt different. Something inside her had shifted, something she couldn't quite name. And though she didn't know what would happen next, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back to pretending anymore. Weeks passed, and the hallway remained a quiet witness to the changes stirring in Emily's life. The walls, now fully dried, glowed softly under the sunlight that filtered through the windows each morning. The color was warm, comforting, almost like it was holding space for memories yet to come. But more than the walls, it was the absence and presence of people in her life that made the air feel different. Daniel still came home late most nights, absorbed in work and calls, often too tired to notice the small details Emily had once thought mattered to him. He admired the hallway only briefly, commenting, "Looks nice," before returning to his study. There was no excitement in his voice, no curiosity, no pause to see what she felt about the change. She had grown used to the pattern of indifference, but it no longer satisfied her. It didn't make her sad anymore. It made her reflective. Emily often found herself standing in the hall alone, running her fingers along the smooth paint, recalling moments with Mark. His presence had been brief, yet it had made a quiet shift in her world. Not in a way that threatened her marriage, but in a way that reminded her of herself, of her capacity to feel, to notice, to be seen. Mark had left a week ago, after finishing the painting. His words, soft and careful, still lingered in her mind. "Don't let the quiet take you again." They had been simple, almost ordinary, but they struck something deep. She realized that silence had shaped much of her life, filling spaces where understanding and warmth should have been. With him, the silence hadn't been empty, it had been honest. respectful, alive. One afternoon, Emily decided to photograph the hallway. She arranged the light and shadow, capturing the way the walls reflected the sun. It wasn't just about documenting a new color. It was about capturing what she had learned in those few days, how attention, care, and even brief moments of understanding could alter the feeling of a place. She looked at the photos, seeing the warmth, not just in the paint, but in herself. In the reflection of her hands along the wall, Daniel's indifference continued, a constant background hum. He still didn't ask about her days or the small joys she'd rediscovered. She didn't correct him. She no longer felt the need to chase acknowledgement from someone who had drifted so far away. Instead, she focused on what mattered, what made her feel alive and seen. Even if only in small ways, she found herself thinking about Mark often, but not in longing or regret. She thought about him with gratitude, a gentle appreciation for the way he had quietly reminded her of who she was. His words and actions had not been a threat. They had been a mirror reflecting the parts of herself she had forgotten existed. One evening, Emily walked through the hallway, pausing in front of a framed photo of her and Daniel at the beach. She touched the frame lightly, remembering the laughter and warmth of that day. Yet the memory no longer brought ache, it brought understanding. People change, sometimes apart from one another. She had learned that love wasn't only about grand gestures or daily validation. Sometimes it was about recognition, presence, and honest even in silence. She realized that the hallway itself had become symbolic of her journey. The fresh paint represented her awakening. The care Mark had shown represented acknowledgement, and the stillness of the house represented reflection. Every time she walked through it, she felt the subtle reminder. Life and love could continue quietly, without noise or drama, but with depth and meaning. One morning, she heard the hum of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway. She prepared herself for the usual brief exchange, but today she was different. When he entered the hall, she noticed how the walls caught the sunlight, how calm the space felt. She smiled gently. "Looks great," he said absently, glancing at the paint. "Yes, does," she replied softly, her voice steady. "Thank you for noticing." You didn't understand the deeper significance of her words. He probably never would. But she didn't mind. She no longer needed his understanding to feel complete. Her recognition of herself and her experiences was enough. Later, she walked to the window and looked outside, the streets quiet under the morning sun. She felt a strange mix of melancholy and empowerment. The loneliness that had once weighed heavily on her had shifted, was lighter now, shaped by awareness and gentle self-love rather than dependence. Emily also thought about what she had learned from Mark, that attention and care didn't always require romantic involvement, that simple acknowledgement could restore hope and vitality. She realized how often she had stayed silent, hoping to preserve peace, but ignoring her own needs. The brief connection she had shared with him was a lesson in emotional honesty. A reminder that feeling deeply was not wrong, even if circumstances didn't allow for change. That evening, she set up her camera again, photographing the hallway from different angles. She noticed how the light moved across the walls at different times of day, how shadows softened the edges of her memories. Each photo was more than just a visual record. It was a narrative of growth, of quiet courage, reclaiming herself without disrupting the life she still shared with Daniel. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "I see you now. I see me." The words felt powerful, resonating through the empty hall, echoing softly against the walls. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the sting of neglect. She felt clarity. Days passed, and Emily continued her routines, but with subtle changes. She greeted neighbors with warmth, spent time on her photography, and nurtured small joys that had been buried under years of habit and silence. The hall remained a constant, changed in structure, yet transformed in meaning. It reminded her of the balance she had found, honoring her marriage, her home, and herself, while also recognizing the need for acknowledgement and emotional care. One afternoon, she found herself staring at a corner of the hallway where the paint was slightly uneven, a tiny imperfection left behind by Mark. It was human, real, and perfect in its imperfection. She smiled, thinking about him. Thinking about the brief moments that had taught her the depth of presence and care. Emily understood. Now that infidelity was not always a physical act. Sometimes it was emotional, the moments when you longed to be understood, noticed, or validated elsewhere. She hadn't crossed that line, and she didn't need to. She had learned something more important: self-recognition, emotional honesty, and gentle awakening. That night she lit a candle in the hallway. The soft glow reflected off the warm walls, creating a serene, almost sacred space. She walked slowly through it, letting her hands brush lightly against the paint, feeling the history of her own emotions in every corner. The hallway had witnessed her silence,